A young woman was found murdered in a Kentucky field, with her head completely severed from her body. She was 5 months pregnant and had been drugged before she was killed. Her head was removed from the scene and was never recovered. The men responsible were not criminals. They were educated dental students, men she trusted. Her name was Pearl Bryan. This is a documented true crime case. On the morning of February 1st, 1896, a man walking near Fort Thomas, Kentucky, stumbled upon something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. In a desolate field near the Licking River, partially hidden by winter brush, lay the body of a young woman. Her clothing was torn and disheveled. Her throat had been slashed with such violence that her head was completely severed from her body. Blood had pooled in the frozen ground beneath where her neck should have been. There was no head anywhere at the scene. The discovery sent shockwaves through the small community. Local police were called immediately. As investigators examined the body, several details became clear. There were no defensive wounds on her hands or arms. There were no signs of sexual assault. This was not a robbery gone wrong. The violence was targeted, methodical, and deliberate. Whoever killed this woman had planned it carefully, and they had taken her head with them. But who was she? Without a head, identification seemed nearly impossible. This was 1896, decades before fingerprint databases or DNA testing. Investigators had to rely on other methods. They examined her clothing. She wore a dark dress, undergarments, and shoes that suggested she came from a middle-class background. Her hands showed no signs of hard labor. She wore a ring. In her pockets, they found a few personal items, but nothing with a name. Police began checking missing person reports from nearby Cincinnati, just across the Ohio River. Within days, they found a match. A young woman named Pearl Bryan had been reported missing by her family. She was 22 years old and had last been seen in Cincinnati on the evening of January 31st. The clothing description matched. The timeline matched. Dental records confirmed it. The headless body in the Kentucky field was Pearl Bryan. Pearl Bryan was born in 1873 in Greencastle, Indiana. She came from a respectable, middle-class family. Her father was a farmer, and her mother was a homemaker. Pearl was the youngest of several children and was described by everyone who knew her as intelligent, soft-spoken, and trusting. She had received a solid education for a young woman of her era. She could read and write well. She had dreams of a conventional future, marriage, a family of her own. In the 1890s, opportunities for unmarried women were limited. Most lived with their families until marriage. But Pearl was independent. She had moved to Cincinnati to work as a clerk, supporting herself financially. She was engaged to be married to a young man back in Indiana. Everything seemed to be falling into place for her, but Pearl carried a secret that would cost her everything. She was 5 months pregnant and unmarried. In 1896, America, an unwed pregnancy was not just a scandal, it was a complete and total ruination. Families disowned daughters. Employers fired them on the spot. Churches shunned them. Women who became pregnant outside of marriage had almost no options. Abortion was illegal and extremely dangerous. Many women died from botched procedures. Adoption was rare and carried deep shame. Most women who found themselves in Pearl's situation were forced to give birth in secret and then abandon their children. The social stigma was devastating and permanent. Pearl was terrified. She couldn't tell her family. So she confided in 2 men she believed she could trust. 2 men who presented themselves as educated, respectable, and willing to help. He was 26 years old, well-dressed, and articulate. He came from a good family and was seen as ambitious and socially acceptable. People who met him described him as calm, rational, and persuasive. He had a way of making people feel comfortable and safe. Alonzo Walling was Jackson's close friend and roommate. He was also a dental student, slightly younger and more reserved. But he followed Jackson's lead in almost everything. Pearl had met Scott Jackson through mutual acquaintances. When she realized she was pregnant, she reached out to him for advice. Jackson assured her that her problem could be handled quietly and safely. He told her he knew people who could help. He offered to arrange medical assistance. He promised that no one would need to know. If anyone discovered he was involved with her, his reputation would be destroyed. His career as a dentist would be over before it started. His family would disown him. He decided that killing Pearl was the only way to eliminate the risk permanently. She told her landlady she was going out to meet friends and would return later that night. She was seen leaving with Scott Jackson and Alonzo Walling. Witnesses later testified that she appeared calm and willing. She believed she was being taken to receive medical help. That was the last time anyone saw Pearl Bryan alive. During the journey, Pearl was drugged. Investigators concluded she had likely been given chloroform or a similar chemical to incapacitate her. Chloroform was commonly used by dentists at the time for sedation during procedures. Jackson and Walling would have had easy access to it. Once Pearl was unconscious, she was transported across the Ohio River into Kentucky. The men had chosen a remote, isolated field near Fort Thomas, far from any witnesses or help. What happened next was brutal and prolonged. Medical examiners who later examined Pearl's body testified that her throat had been cut repeatedly with extreme force. The decapitation was not a single clean cut. It required sustained, deliberate effort. This was not an impulsive act of violence. This was methodical. After killing her, the men removed her head entirely. Investigators believe this was done to delay identification and make it harder for police to connect the body to Pearl. The head was never found. Some speculated it was thrown into the Ohio River. Others believed it was buried somewhere in the woods. The men made no attempt to bury her or hide her. They simply left her there and walked away. The next morning, she was discovered. News of the murder spread rapidly. Newspapers across the United States picked up the story. Headlines screamed about the pregnant woman found decapitated in Kentucky. The gruesome details captivated the public. People were horrified not just by the violence, but by the cruelty of it. Pearl had been betrayed by people she trusted. She had been lured to her death by men who smiled at her, reassured her, and promised to help her. Police began reconstructing Pearl's final movements. Witnesses came forward saying they had seen her with Scott Jackson and Alonzo Walling on the night she disappeared. When questioned, both men claimed they had parted ways with Pearl earlier in the evening. They said she had gone off on her own. Physical evidence tied them to the crime. Pearl's personal belongings were found in their possession. Bloodstains were discovered on clothing they had recently discarded. Witnesses placed them near the murder scene. Correspondence between Pearl and Jackson showed he had been deeply involved in managing her pregnancy. He had written to her multiple times, discussing options and offering to help. He needed it to go away. Both men were arrested and charged with first-degree murder. The trial became a national spectacle. Courtrooms were packed with spectators. It was one of the first true media circuses in American criminal history. Prosecutors laid out the case in devastating detail. They presented evidence of the drugging, the transportation to Kentucky, and the methodical killing. Medical experts testified about the force necessary to decapitate a human being. They described how the head had been sawed and cut away from the body. They emphasized that it had never been recovered. Witnesses dismantled Jackson and Walling's alibis piece by piece. Letters were read aloud in court, showing Jackson's growing desperation about Pearl's pregnancy. They suggested that Pearl might have been killed by someone else entirely, but the prosecution had too much. The timeline was clear. The motive was clear. The physical evidence was overwhelming. During the trial, both Jackson and Walling attempted to shift blame onto each other. Jackson claimed Walling had done the actual killing. Walling claimed Jackson had planned everything and forced him to help. Even as graphic details of Pearl's murder were described in court, both men remained calm and detached. This lack of emotion intensified public outrage. The jury deliberated for less than a day. They returned guilty verdicts for both Scott Jackson and Alonzo Walling. Both men were sentenced to death by hanging. The courtroom erupted in applause. Outside, crowds cheered. Pearl's family, who had attended every day of the trial, wept with relief. On March 20th, 1897, Scott Jackson and Alonzo Walling were executed by hanging at the Campbell County Jail in Newport, Kentucky. Thousands of people gathered outside. Reporters from across the country were present. Contemporary accounts noted that both men appeared calm in their final moments. Jackson reportedly said nothing. Neither man ever revealed what they had done with Pearl's head. Pearl Bryan's family buried what remained of her body in Greencastle, Indiana. He died without ever finding it. The murder of Pearl Bryan became one of the most infamous crimes of the 19th century. It inspired books, articles, stage plays, and songs. Rumors and folklore spread. Some claimed Pearl's ghost wandered the field where she was killed, searching for her missing head. Others said her spirit haunted the dental college where Jackson and Walling had studied. For decades, the case was used as a cautionary tale about trusting the wrong people. But beyond the sensationalism and the ghost stories, the murder of Pearl Bryan represents something darker. They drugged her. They transported her to an isolated location. They killed her in the most brutal way imaginable, and they showed no remorse. This case also highlights how society failed women like Pearl. Women who became pregnant outside of marriage had almost no safe options. They were forced to rely on secrecy, dangerous medical procedures, or the goodwill of others. Pearl Bryan trusted the wrong people because she had no other choice. Society had left her with nowhere else to turn. Scott Jackson and Alonzo Walling were executed for their crime. But the horror of what they did continues to haunt us. Pearl's head was never found. Her family never got closure. And the question remains, what kind of person can look someone in the eye, promise to help them, and then kill them in cold blood? Pearl Bryan was 22 years old. She was 5 months pregnant. She was murdered by people she trusted. Her killers were hanged. But her head was never recovered. and that's why this case remains one of the most disturbing in American history.